According to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which is the oldest world court since 1899, it said that in the 19th century, the Hawaiian Kingdom existed as an independent state, recognized as such by the United States, Great Britain, and various other states. And that sovereignty was exercised by the Hawaiian Kingdom government. Well, that government, we know, was illegally overthrown in 1893, admitted it was illegal, the United States President, Cleveland. But by overthrowing the government, that did not mean the country ceased to exist. So how did the Hawaiian Islands become a part of the United States? That's a fundamental question, right? How? Well, annexation. This is how annexation takes place between countries, called international law. Cession of state territory is the transfer of sovereignty over state territory by the owner state to another state. And the only form in which a cession can be effected is an agreement embodied in a treaty between the ceding and the acquiring state. So here we have two sovereign entities, two sovereign countries, both have their governments that represent them. One will cede territory to another country, either voluntary, right, they negotiate, or involuntary, as a result of war. The majority of the United States was acquired through ceded lands from foreign countries. The first land to be transferred to the United States from a foreign country happened in 1803, and that's called the Louisiana Purchase. That was followed up in 1819, a cession from Spain, which is the area that we know today as Florida. Pacific Northwest from the British in 1846. Alaska, 1867, from Russia. These were voluntary cessions, negotiated. But you also have an example, a few examples, but one here, a treaty of conquest, treaty of peace, treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, that ended the Mexican-American War. So what is the authority of Hawaii's annexation? Obviously, we would have to look for a treaty, especially when we keep saying ceded lands today, because ceded lands implies there's been a transaction. Something was ceded. Actually, it goes back to July 7, 1898, a joint resolution to provide for annexing the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. A joint resolution is not a treaty. A joint resolution is municipal law of the United States Congress. It's not a treaty, and that's important. Now, what were the congressmen saying at that time regarding this prospect of annexing Hawaii without a treaty? Well, of many senators and representatives on the record, Senator William Allen from Nebraska said it best. He said the Constitution and the statutes are territorial in their operation. That is, they can have no binding force or operation beyond the territorial limits of the government in which they are promulgated. In other words, the Constitution and statutes cannot reach across the territorial boundary of the United States into the territorial domain of another government and affect that government or persons or property therein. The joint resolution of annexation is ipso facto null and void. So he's not arguing you can't annex. He says this never happened because it's an American law. It's not a treaty. 2 years later, the United States Congress passed another law called the Organic Act, April 30th, 1900, renaming the Hawaiian Kingdom government, its infrastructure, to the territory of Hawaii. And in 1959, the United States passed another law, Public Law 86-3, called the Statehood Act. Again, it's a municipal law. And then in 1993, the United States Congress passed a joint resolution apologizing for the illegal overthrow. But again, it's just an American law, limited to US territory. So what does the United States Supreme Court say about US laws? It says neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in pursuance of it, referring to the federal Constitution and the federal statutes, have any force in foreign country. They don't have any force in a foreign country because of that country's independence. On December 18, 1893, the United States President admitted to the United States Congress in a manifesto, by an act of war, the government of a friendly and confiding people has been overthrown. Act of war, that is a trigger word for state of war, which initiates the law of occupation, takes it out of the state of peace. Overthrowing the government does not equate to an overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an independent state. So the focus should have been not getting a government, but whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists. That's the focus that nobody was looking at. January 17th, 1893 marks the beginning of the American occupation. Well, here's the answer, why we don't know, and it's okay, because I'm not here to blame anybody. We're all victims of circumstance. The insurgents, they're all dead. The children are not insurgents, right? If my dad committed a crime, don't blame me. Hold my dad accountable, right? So this is not about blaming, this is about understanding. So here is a guy named Samuel Damon. He's an insurgent. By the way, he's a Hawaiian subject. He's Hawaiian, not by ethnicity. Right? And in 1895, when he also served as trustee of the Kamehameha schools, he stated on the record, if we are ever to have peace and annexation, the first thing to do is to obliterate the past. It's called denationalization. So denationalization is an international term. It's to obliterate the national consciousness of the occupied state. And denationalization in 1919, after World War I, was designated as a war crime during occupations. Specifically, the war crime attempts to denationalize the inhabitants of occupied territory. 1906, that statement by Samuel Damon became a policy in the Board of Education. The theme of the program was to indoctrinate the children of the Hawaiian Islands to be American and to speak English. In 1907, Harper's Weekly magazine published an article on this brainwashing. And here at the command of the principal, this picture shows the 714 school children saluting. And the caption says what they say at the command of the principal: we give our heads and our hearts to God and our country, one language, one flag. This scene shows a salute to the American flag, which flies in the grounds of the Ka'iulani Public School, which has many Japanese pupils. The drill is constantly held as a means of inculcating patriotism in the hearts of the children. That term, inculcate, is brainwashing through repetition. That's the definition of inculcate. Now, when I first saw this, with my experience in the military, I'm saying we go to war against these kind of guys. I could not believe that was in Hawaii. But we hear stories from kupuna that say they get beaten for speaking Hawaiian. We hear those stories, but we couldn't connect it. Kind of thought it was more racial. I think what is more heinous, this was policy. Did you know even Japanese children who spoke Hawaiian were punished? Because Hawaiian was a national language of a country called the Hawaiian Kingdom, like Spanish is the national language of a country called Spain.